For years I thought there was something deeply wrong with me, but it was because my biology was never explained. I got my first period the day before I turned 12. Not long after that, my emotions became impossible to control before my period. And I would fall into these deep holes of despair where everything went dark. And I remember banging my head on the floor over and over again, thinking, why am I like this? What is wrong with me? And as I got older, it got even worse, and there were times when I couldn't even get out of bed for over a week. It was like this veil of darkness suddenly came over my body. And although somewhere in my head I knew that there were good things and things that were worthwhile and meaningful on the other side of that, I couldn't feel any of it. My mum would stay nearby and watch me during those weeks because she was afraid if she left I would try and take my own life. And I remember when I turned 20, I checked myself into A&E with suicidal ideation. And I told them that I had PMDD because I was already diagnosed. And in the morning, the psychiatrist gave me a couple of leaflets about mental health and sleep and sent me home. And I remember walking out of the hospital and turning round and seeing a sign outside that said this was an outstanding hospital. And I just felt so completely hopeless and alone because no one was listening to me, no one was taking seriously what I was feeling and how I couldn't go on anymore. And then I think the next day was my 20th birthday and I felt so unheard, felt like I couldn't physically open my mouth to speak. And I had some lectures to go to and I thought, I can't even, if anyone asks me how I'm not going to even be able to open my mouth to say anything. So I got this red marker pen and a white piece of paper and wrote on it, "Stop ignoring female hormones." And I went out in my pyjamas and walked around the streets of Bristol holding up this sign. And at that point I was so done. I didn't even care what people thought of me, because I was done being told that it was all just in my head, and I was done blaming myself for the pain that I didn't understand and no one else had bothered to understand. And 3 years later I walked back into the same hospital, but that time I wasn't a patient, I was a PhD researcher working on a continuous hormone monitoring device that will make it much easier to actually do science on women and take into account how these hormones affect everything that we go through. Because women deserve better data, women deserve to be included in studies. Cyclical brains deserve to be recognised and understood. But still I didn't fully understand myself, and I still had this belief inside that I was broken, that something was fundamentally wrong with me, that I couldn't control my emotions, that I was too sensitive. And it wasn't until a couple of years after that I was in France leading my own experiment at a synchrotron beamline, firing neutrons at hormone samples, that I randomly found a research paper showing that you're more likely to develop all kinds of hormonal women's health issues if you experience adverse childhood trauma. And suddenly everything kind of clicked for me, because I realised that me being the way I was wasn't a personal failure. It was exacerbated by the things that I'd gone through and the things that I'd inherited from my parents that they'd gone through, because you can pass down trauma epigenetically via your grandmother and mother. And I know that they were sensitive to hormones, and the things that they went through were still affecting me generations later. And this biology explained things that I'd internally blamed myself for so long. And so my reactions weren't my personal failures, but my nervous system was shaped by trauma, colliding every month with hormonal shifts that amplify threat, emotion and perception. And the worst part of what I lived through wasn't even the symptoms, although they were chronic and debilitating and completely horrific at times. The worst part was actually the self-hatred that I internalized from blaming myself for those symptoms. Those were the things that made me want to take my own life. The belief that I was the problem. The emotional suffering caused by that constant self-blame and self-hatred. And later I found trigger-based, trauma-informed work completely dissolved so many of my triggers. Not because I did more mindset work, but because I use the same biology that causes all this emotional heightening and these trigger responses to update the nervous system and make those trigger responses less powerful. So although I still have the same sensitivities that I used to, the really painful, emotional, trauma-related parts that I had no longer impact me anymore. Not because I tried harder, but because my nervous system finally updated and regained a sense of safety that I never had before. And that's why I do this work. That's why I became a scientist. That's why I help women. Because women are not broken. They are just living in bodies that the system has refused to understand for generations. Because it's not really convenient for the system to acknowledge that the responsibility doesn't lie so much in the individual that is shaped by their experiences, but by the difficulties that society has imposed on the individual is what shapes them to react in the way that they do. And no one should grow up hating themselves because of biology that they were never taught, because of biology that was never studied or acknowledged properly. Because the way that you respond makes complete sense given your biology and your past and your environment. It's completely described by all these things. There's no innate blame to be had in any of it. And that's why I do what I do. That's why I coach women. That's why I study these techniques and the brain and hormones and how all these things interact and trauma and society's role. That's why I'm writing a book on how cyclical brains should be understood and we should reinterpret the way that we treat women's emotions and women's mood fluctuations, not as something for women to be blamed for, but something that is part of our biology, is there to protect us. All these reactions that are pathologized, that arise from our past and our environment and our innate biological sensitivity that itself has been passed down through generations of nervous system dysregulation due to trauma. None of these things make us bad people. None of these things mean that any of it is our fault. And I want to spread the word about that because of how much it affects me personally and how much it affects my family members and how much it affects women that I know. So thank you for listening to all of this. And all your comments, they help so much to motivate me to keep going. I'm just so grateful for all the support.